I'm Tom Hartman in Washington, D.C., and here's what's coming up tonight on The Big Picture. What was conservative America like before Fox News and Rush Limbaugh came to town? And how have they helped to create an alternative reality in American politics? We'll pose that question and more to David Frum in tonight's Conversations with Great Minds. Also, what happened to the moderate Republican? And isn't it time we took the bold action necessary to get Americans back to work? Those questions and more in tonight's Big Picture Rumble. And in tonight's Daily Take, by 2050 or sooner, whites will no longer be the majority in America. So isn't it time lawmakers in Washington and the states accepted this reality and began building an economy and government that works for all Americans, regardless of their race? For tonight's Conversations with Great Minds, I'm joined by David Frum. David is a political commentator and journalist. Between 2001 and 2002, he was a speechwriter and special assistant to then-President George W. Bush. Over the last few years, David has been rather critical of today's Republican Party, as well as the role of conservative media in American politics. David is a contributing editor of both Newsweek and the Daily Beast, and also a contributor on CNN. He's the author of 7 books, including his newest, his first novel, Patriots. David joins me now in the studio. David, welcome.
Thanks for your hospitality, Tom.
Was it appropriate to introduce you as somebody who's been critical of the Republican Party?
Yes, although I remain a conservative and a Republican, and I would like to see modernized republicanism, and my touchstone for that is a formula that has to be environmentally responsible, culturally modern, and economically inclusive. But every democracy has a party of the right and of the left. America needs one too, and I'm somebody who believes in market solutions.
But you're using the word conservative and the word Republican in ways that I think many people, in fact the majority of probably the entire freshman house,
right,
would not acknowledge.
Right. Well,
you're using descriptions that almost sound like Eisenhower.
But look, how this new wave of Republicans have been elected in a moment of national crisis. They've been elected in a moment of high emotion, and they've been elected in a way that has put them inside, I call it an alternative knowledge system, where they've got a specialized set of facts. There's an old saying, you're entitled to your opinion, but not to your own facts. Right. Well, we've pushed forward the frontiers of human rights, so now people are entitled to their own facts. And I think it has embittered the politics of the country. It has made solutions in this time of national crisis more difficult. It has led to worse results from a conservative point of view. From a conservative point of view, there was a better health plan that was available to be negotiated in 2010. The president would have paid a lot for Republican votes. And the topic that I've been trying to work through in my own mind over the past 3 years is, how did this happen? What can be done about it? And finally, I've turned to fiction as a way to understand it, or to help other people to understand it too.
Yeah, and a brilliant and funny new book, Patriots. I want to get into that in the second part of our conversation, if that's all right with you. If we can just hang on with this for a minute. Conservative. What does that word mean to you?
Well, Every country has shorthand, because in most of the democracies we're arguing about the same basic things. We're arguing about the role of the public sector versus the private sector. We're arguing about the benefits of security versus innovation. And so, the conservatives in Britain, the Gaullists in France, the conservatives in Canada, the liberals in Australia, Republicans in the United States. It's the same ecology. But what has happened in the United States, especially recently, is that there are some special factors in this political system that have pushed that party out of alignment with the other kinds of parties. And it has to do, I think, with the desperate fiscal situation of the United States, whereas everybody feels that the future holds only bad news, and there's an old saying that politics is the story of who gets what, when, and how. Well, now we are debating who will be disappointed and by how much. And I think that there are coalitions forming, and the conservative coalition formed more rapidly and intensely to make sure we are going to push the burden of adjustment off our people onto other people, our people being the richer, the older, and the whiter.
And that doesn't seem to be working.
Well, in the short term, it is working. I mean, the Republicans in 2010 did very well.
But not on that overt agenda.
Well, what is the Ryan plan? The Ryan plan says the burden of adjustment is going to be borne, that people over 55 and people who make more than a certain amount of money will be largely exempted from the burden of adjustment, and people under 55 and people who make less money, they will bear all of the burden of adjustment.
You know that, and I know that, but I'll bet you 90% of Fox News viewers don't know that, or Patriot News Network viewers don't know that.
That's the, that's the alternative knowledge system.
And yeah, exactly, and probably 60–70% of Americans don't.
But you know, within the Republican Party, when you ask Republicans, so how do you feel about, you know, would you accept if the choice comes down to new revenues or Medicare cuts? Even, and by the way, I am in favor of cuts, but if you put that to the Republican rank and file, they say no. I mean, the Republican Party, you know, not the activist base, people identify, that's a big bunch of people. And they're not going to be that different from the rest of America. They're going to share, when you have overwhelming consensus on things, they're going to share views. And a lot of the story of what has happened in American politics is how relatively small activist groups can capture parties and move them in very extreme directions.
But that classical conservative, or that classical Republican, large R Republican, that is probably well reflected by the policies and presidencies of Eisenhower and Nixon, you know, before Nixon went crazy. The Republican of my dad was an Eisenhower Republican, and was very active in the party. And in fact, I went door to door for Barry Goldwater in 1964. I was 13 years old. 3 years later, I was getting arrested in East Lansing and you know, anti-war riots. But that party, you know, Dwight Eisenhower's famous letter to his brother Edgar in 1954. You know, there's this small number of oil millionaires who think that they can do away with Social Security and labor protections. Their number is small and they're stupid. Yeah. That party is, it seems, gone. I mean, well, you have Richard Lugar in Indiana. He's going to get wiped out this week.
But that party, one of the things that I see with great foreboding is that, no, that party is there. It's just been, the leadership of the party has become much more radical than the rank and file. And they are taking risks. You know, one of the big differences between liberals and conservatives in America, if you believe people's self-description. Now, people don't always, most people don't follow politics very closely, and they don't always describe themselves very accurately, but still. About 20% of Americans call themselves liberal, and about 38 and now close to 40% of Americans call themselves conservatives. Now, when you're 20% of the population, you know you're in the minority. It is just so overwhelmingly true. So you know you have to do coalition politics. And so liberals are always ready to make deals with centrist Democrats, because otherwise they'll just lose. When you're 40%, you have this idea, one big push. That's all. It was so close to being the majority in the country. Why compromise? And in recent years, as the fiscal situation has gotten more desperate, and the economic situation, and as conservatives have had the non-benefit, but the imagined benefit of these new information systems that give them, you know, their own particular set of facts, that the temptation to take big risks, go for big results, has become stronger and stronger. Mitt Romney is the latest victim of it. I mean, there's a tragedy unfolding there of a very intelligent man who's being pushed into positions that he knows are not politically good for him, and that he struggles to avoid. He struggled to avoid endorsing a second tax cut. He struggled to avoid endorsing the Ryan plan, and he was pushed and pushed and pushed. This latest incident with his foreign policy spokesman is an example of this. Romney didn't want to see that person go, but he couldn't quite mobilize him to keep him either.
Well, his father, George, was kind of an Eisenhower Republican.
Well, his father George was an opponent of Barry Goldwater, who in 1960, whom you supported.
And I remember George. I grew up in Michigan. He was my governor.
So in 1964, that George Romney said, "I accept the Goldwater nomination, but I do not endorse it," and he refused to campaign for him. And that, by the way, is an important reason why he wasn't the nominee in 1968. And young Mitt, who was one of his father's closest political allies, a brilliant young man, they're very youngest son, they're very, very close, learned his father was too blunt, too confrontational, and his father ultimately lost the big prize.
Right. To what extent has money corrupted the Republican Party and the conservative movement? It seems that values, this whole, the traditional value systems even, have been set aside in the pursuit of.
But it's not. this is a place where you cannot distinguish the parties. That the wash of money through Washington has transformed everybody and everything. To avert to the book, that one of the villains of the book is a Democrat, a super lobbyist, who begins his life as an anti-apartheid campaigner, and he now has a big farm on the Eastern Shore, which he calls Mandela Farm, in honor to his old anti-apartheid. And he then. When people chat, he works for to help offshore jobs to India, and when people say to him, "How can you do this? I mean, you're a big liberal," and he says, "Well, I learned from the anti-apartheid struggle that justice is global, but it pays."
But the money seems to have. I mean, right now, conservative PACs, Republican PACs are out fundraising Democratic PACs 8 to 1, 8 to 1. These super PACs.
But the last two cycles, the Democrats did better. 2008, 2004.
That was all pre-Citizens United.
That's pre-Citizens United, but there'll be new frontiers in technology. It also has to do with where is the energy. You know, on the campaign finance is only a small part of the problem of the flow of money through the city.
The question, though, is the Republican Party even still a legitimate Republican Party or a legitimate political party, or has it just become a shill for large transnational corporations and a small band of very loud, cranky billionaires?
It also represents, and should represent again, the aspirations and hopes of lots of middle-class people. I mean, I speak to Republican clubs all the time. I will speak with Outfried or Republican clubs all across the country. I go to all these, and it's a party of people who own things, but often not very big things. It's the party of people who are married and have children. It's the party of sort of the leaders of small-scale communities, and those people right now they're not at their best because, look, we're living through an economic depression. And as we saw in the 1930s, as we saw in the 1890s, very hard times bring out the worst in people. They make them fearful, they make them angry, they make them believe that this catastrophe must have been planned by somebody, because nothing so terrible as this could be the result of simple mistake or the workings of economic forces there. And you see that so much and you would have seen, by the way, had it happened that a Republican had won in 2008, you would see a lot of these emotions on the Democratic side. The Democrats are calmer because they are defending an incumbent president who is struggling to cope with these problems, not altogether successfully.
Very, very interesting. We'll be back. More conversations with great minds with David Frum right after this break. The decline of American power continues.
Are things in our country so bad that it might actually be time for a revolution?
And it turns out that a popular drink at Starbucks has a surprising ingredient: bugs.
You know how sometimes you see a story and it seems so whole and complete, you think you understand it, and then you glimpse something else. You hear or see some other part of it and realize everything you thought you knew, you don't know? I'm Thom Hartmann. Welcome to The Big Picture.
Welcome to the Ilona Show, where you'll get the real headlines with none of the mercy. The problem with the mainstream media today is that they're completely disconnected from the viewers and from what actually matters to those viewers. And so that's why young people just don't watch TV anymore. If they want news, they go online and read it. But we're trying to take those stories that people actually care about and transfer them back to TV.
back to Conversations with Great Minds with David Frum, former speechwriter, special assistant to then President George W. Bush, and author of 7 books, including his newest and first novel, Patriots. Let's get back to it. David, in your book, you've got this cast of characters that is startlingly familiar. You've got a television network, Patriot News Network, with a bunch of foxy babes who are presenting the news and doing, the alternate universe that we were just talking about. Yeah. A presidential candidate who goes rogue, but in a good way. An unending war in Mexico. I don't want to give away too much of the book, but how did these pieces fit together? And
what I wanted to do, what I wanted to do was to show people some of the reality of our politics without getting them distracted by their feelings about current issues. So I took a lot of the things that people feel most intensely about. I created this alternate world where we took them out of the way. So yeah, there's this long-running war, but it's not the war you know. And there's this terrible, unending depression. But we're very hazy about exactly what year it is. And we're very hazy about some of the recent past. They don't refer to people like Ronald Reagan or Richard Nixon. We know the Civil War occurred. We know World War II occurred. But beyond that, it's very hazy. Because I want to take you to the mechanism of politics. What has happened here is that the more conservative party, which are a different name, the Constitutionalists, they have, in desperation, because they knew they could not win the election anyway, turned to a war hero whom they count on to be putty in their hands. And this man is quite a cunning figure, has allowed them to think this. He sort of played dumb. And he's in a wheelchair, he's got terrible burns all over his body, and they make him they're persuaded by the masterminds in the party to make him their nominee. He becomes president, and he shows that he has ideas of his own. And then a mutiny begins to take form against him within his own party. The action here is all within that one party. The heroes and villains are within that one party. This mutiny takes form against him. And my narrator, who is a pretty aimless young man, and who
mustard air.
A mustard, and he represents a lot of what is wrong with the American upper class. He's self-indulgent. He thinks only about, at the beginning, very preoccupied with his sex life and his food life, and he's got some sadness in his past that he thinks gives him an excuse that he can't see what a crazily privileged person he is, and he doesn't believe he has responsibilities. And he is then sent to Washington because he's failed at everything else, and he then rises because of a series of accidents, and because, of course, of the instinct of people in the city to kiss up to money.
If I may interrupt you, that description you just gave is the description that I would use to characterize George W. Bush, who you used to work for. I'm guessing that you wouldn't think of it that way, or?
Well, Bush had this. I think you could describe Bush that way for the first 40 years of his life. And then he had this crisis with alcohol and religion that made him suddenly a very self-propelled person. To get to be president is a very difficult thing. You don't sort of bumble into it. And whatever his faults as president, I mean, this was a man of ambition and focus and self-discipline. And the way he overcame the alcohol is testament to that. And maybe my character here, I mean, we leave him, when we say goodbye to him, he's still only 28 years old. And maybe we see him beginning to grow into himself. But what he has done is he has had to confront, as we all have, the dysfunction of this political system. And he's also had to confront the kind of people who buy books. I mean, this is a minority, watching this show, reading this book, that qualifies you as somebody with, probably more financial resources than most, a little bit more scope to think about things, certainly more feeling than most people have that your voice deserves to be heard. And one of the things I've taken from this financial crisis, really had to think a lot about how most people don't think they've got a right to be heard. They feel that it's correct that they are acted upon, that it's correct that things happen to them. But there are a small number of people who think it's not correct. I have a voice, or I should have one. And if I don't, society's gone amiss. And Walter begins to wake up to some of those things.
Your protagonist.
Yes, my protagonist. And through a series of pretty ludicrous adventures. I mean, the book is a comedy. And a lot of the things that happen to him I want people to laugh, because this situation is grim. And if it isn't funny, I'm not going to hold you. My sense of what you were calling for in the book, if it wouldn't be a stretch to suggest
and you don't even need to acknowledge this, but it certainly seems to suggest that the book is, meta to real life. That the Patriot News Network is a call for a more rational Republican Party. Or,
Well, one of the inspirational figures in the book is a senator, the last of the moderate senators, he's a Republican and constitutionalist from Rhode Island, and he mentors Walter. But you see also the system, you can't be too much better than the system. We see him tucking the envelopes of the campaign contributions into his chest pocket. He raises this huge fund that he holds his seat largely because the governor of his state is an egomaniac who so hates everybody in his own party that he would rather see that this guy keep the seat than ever support any of the nationalists, which are the party that the Democrats who might challenge him. And that you see how much of the life of Washington is driven by petty ego. And you see flattery and how that's done. You see, and you see the all-pervasive effect of money and self-indulgence. Hard to get a dinner reservation in Washington on a Thursday night.
It actually is. I mean, I've lived here only 2 years, and one of the things that amazed me about Washington is what a bubble it is. I mean,
yes.
how much wealth is in this city. It's lobbyists start at a couple $100,000 a year. It's just and there's thousands of them in this.
Well, at one point, Walter, there's a radio host who's a real voice of the people. He's always excoriating the elites.
Right.
And they arrange that Walter then goes to work for a taxpayer-funded group. I mean, because he's inadvertently becomes this hero of the hard right, and he goes to work for this taxpayer group. And one of his responsibilities is to book a private plane for this broadcaster. And he books a plane that the broadcaster doesn't think is appropriate to the broadcaster station, and he throws a fit in the private aviation terminal at Dulles Airport. And that's a real place. I mean, you can go there and you see. It's an instructive thing. It's an instructive thing to spend an afternoon in the private aviation terminal at Dulles Airport.
Yeah. Well, I've actually, I've seen a TV host do that about a hotel room. I mean,
yeah.
It's not all that unusual, actually. So, from the meta to the real, I mean, what was the Republican Party like before Fox News?
Yes.
And before Rush Limbaugh? Pre-87, pre-90, Fox News started in 95 or thereabouts or something.
Before the advent of Fox News, Republicans had to speak the same language as everybody else. When we had a common media culture, with all of its biases and prejudices, and Republicans had complaints about how they were treated and the unfairness of media culture, and it's true, but it forced everybody to speak with certain common frames of reference, and if you said that the incentives for being a wild person, there were even in the 50s and 60s, there were livings to be made on the political margin. I mean, there's a book called None Dare Call It Treason. You'll remember these
John
things.
Stormer.
Right, from your vote. Okay. They would sell millions of copies.
It did, yeah.
But if you watch the CBS Evening News, you would never know that it existed.
Well, that was the John Birch Society. I mean, that's in fact that's where I got a copy of it. Was at a JBS meeting.
But in the Phil Schlafly's book, these things would be out there, they would circulate, but there was a kind of formal culture, and people spoke in a certain way, and they participated in a certain way, and certain subjects were discussed, and Republicans had to learn to play in that way. So you could not play in politics and say any effort to move money to people who are unemployed was socialism, right. Because then the people at the CBS Evening News would treat you like a wild man, and you'd be in trouble. And so,
right. If ever Dirksen had called Jack Kennedy a socialist, right. he would not have been invited back on Face the Nation, even right. Ever Dirksen.
And the political system, the political system of the time, the media system reinforced a political system that forced cooperation. And one of the things that has really changed is that people always say it's worse than it used to be. And if you say it long enough, people think, well, it can't always be true that it was worse than it used to be. But if you're in a long, slow decline, it can be. And you have a political system in the United States that is functioning worse and worse than it used to. One of my favorite quotes about politics is a line of Tip O'Neill's, who was interviewed when he left office. And he'd served since the early 50s, more than 30 years. And he was asked, how Congress changed in his time. And he said, the people are better, the results are worse.
Are we in a long, slow decline right now?
The political institutions of the country are in a long, slow decline.
So what, I mean, we've seen these cycles. We saw the eruption of the New Deal. We saw the eruption of Reconstruction after the Civil War.
Yeah.
We saw, you know, the change of the Revolutionary War. It seems like every 80 years there's a major crisis and change. But what will bring about the next change? What's going to reform this?
It's the same. It's the same thing that always reforms. In the 1850s, in the 1910s, in more modern times, it is the coming together of popular protest with a responsible elite that comes up with reforms both to satisfy the popular movement, but also because it doesn't want the popular movement to get out of control.
But isn't there a third piece, which is a certain threshold of pain that has to be hit? And could it be that we're not there yet?
Right. It's pretty damn painful.
It is, but it's nothing like it was in the 30s.
Well, yeah.
Well, no, I'm saying you look at those, you know, the crash of 1768, the crash of 1857, the crash of 1929.
Yeah.
You know, they all brought about massive change. We had this crash in 2008 that easily could have been 1929.
What has happened when we've had positive changes in this society, and this is really the great theme of the book, that what we see is we see in the book a popular protest movement that is directionless, destructive, and manipulated by powerful forces. And we see the utter absence of the responsible elite to say, the job of political elites is to compete to offer solutions to public problems. And where they go wrong is when they compete to exploit them. And with worthless Walter, that at the end of the book, he has this instinct that if politics is to go anywhere, he has to become a different kind of elite person than he has been through his whole life, and that anybody around him is. He has, and as he says at the end, that he has to decide, I'm going to try to make things just a little bit better over the course of my political career.
That's marvelous. Well, let's hope that we can all make things a little bit better. David Frum, great speaking with you. Thank you for joining us tonight. To see this or other Conversations with Great Minds, go to our website at conversationswithgreatminds.com. Coming up after the break, Indiana Senator Dick Lugar will likely lose to his Tea Party challenger in Indiana's Republican primary Tuesday. As a Republican who supported the auto bailout and President Obama's Supreme Court nominees, does his likely departure from Congress signal the death of the moderate Republican? That and more in tonight's Big Picture Rumble.
The decline of American power continues.
Are things in our country so bad that it might actually be time for a revolution?
And it turns out that a popular drink at Starbucks has a surprising ingredient: bugs.
You know how sometimes you see a story and it seems so whole and complete, you think you understand it, and then you glimpse something else. You hear or see some other part of it and realize everything you thought you knew, you don't know? I'm Thom Hartmann. Welcome to The Big Picture.
Welcome to the Alona Show. You'll get the real headlines with none of the mercy. The problem with the mainstream media today is that they're completely disconnected from the viewers and from what actually matters to those viewers. And so that's why young people just don't watch TV anymore. If they want news, they go online and read it. But we're trying to take those stories that people actually care about and transfer them back to TV.
Welcome to the Capital Account. I'm Lauren Lister.
It's Friday. Are you ready to rumble? Joining me for tonight's Big Picture Rumble are Dan Holler, Communications Director at Heritage Action for America, Rania Khalek, thank you, journalist and regular contributor to Alternet, and Nicholas Balassi, senior video reporter at the Daily Caller. Thank you all for joining me tonight. Let's start out with these job numbers. The unemployment rate dropped by 0.1% today, 8.1%, 26 consecutive months of private job creation. In fact, all on President Obama's watch. And in fact, the private jobs, we've got a chart someplace here. There we go. This is up on the screen. This is the cumulative change in the private sector and the public sector. And what you can see is that the private sector jobs are back to where they were when Obama came into office. Public sector jobs are dropping, though, because mostly Republican governors are laying off people all over the country. Thoughts on this? It seems, this seems like a success story, but not quite enough.
I think we have to look at what's happening on the labor market. And one of the big things that we've heard all day long is that, you know what, people are dropping out of the labor market, and that's why we see the unemployment rate going down. And there's a lot of truth to that. If as many people were in the labor market as when President Obama came into office, unemployment would be at 11.1%. So we might be making progress, but there's still a long way to go.
But this is also 26 months of continuous job creation.
Well, I think what this definitely shows is that the private sector cannot be counted on to lift us out of this unemployment crisis that we have on its own. This shows us that we need serious government investment and spending in job creation. I think that's what we should all be taking out of this.
Yeah. Well, and Rania, how much do we need of that? I mean,
a lot more than we've been putting in. And, Obama had a stimulus a while back that worked, but it wasn't enough. A lot of economists said it wasn't enough. I'm talking about like Paul Krugman type economists. We need bigger stimuluses. We need more money and investment into job creation. And right now we have this Congress of Republicans that won't allow us to pass any of that kind of legislation. We just have this austerity obsession that hasn't gone away.
And Nicholas, austerity in the UK is just devastating the UK. In fact, I think we've got we have a graph of this too. Let me just show you this. Let me get your take on it if we can pull it up. Here we go. This is the yellow line is the United States. We chose a stimulus path. Europe, actually the UK chose a cutting path, an austerity, the Republican path, and they're actually falling even behind the Eurozone, which is all in recession now. So, how can the Republicans continue to pursue this?
Well, if you look what's happening in the United States, the question is, can we afford it? I mean, the debt is
sure
now...
we can. We're a wealthy nation.
But the debt is equal to the size of the entire economy.
No, it's not.
Right now.
A, it's not there, and B, an awful lot of that debt is money we owe ourselves. You got $2.7 trillion in the Social Security Trust Fund. It's considered part of the debt, but it's not part of the debt.
But are you saying the debt isn't important, though, right now?
Yeah, absolutely, I'm saying that. When we got out of World War II, our debt to GDP ratio, right now it's between 80 and 90%, depending on how you calculate it, or between 60 and 80%, 60 and 70% if you take out public debt. So at the end of World War II, it was a genuine 127% of GDP. And how did Dwight Eisenhower, the Republican president, get us out of that debt? He borrowed even more money and built infrastructure, built a national highway system, built schools, built hospitals, put America back to work.
Well, the president's team of economic advisors and the president himself said 8%. Unemployment is not going to... That's what he said initially, and it didn't happen. So, I mean, how much more investment?
I mean, there's been studies to show that for every increase, every dollar the government increases spending by, private sector investment, the economy falls by 50%. So we have to sort of debunk this multiplier effect. If the government is going to spend money, it's going to come out of the pockets of somebody, and borrowing is going to have a downward effect. So there's not a multiplier effect that we're led to believe.
If you spend money on job creation, though, you have more people to tax, and you get more revenue out of that. I don't know what study you're citing, but it's pretty much common knowledge that when government invests in job creation, you get more out of it. You have people back to work. You get money from consumers. Consumers are where job creation lies, us, not, we're the job creators. And we need government to invest in that. And I would also add that with Obama, I mean, this doesn't, I don't think this reflects well on Obama, and I'm not arguing that Obama's done a brilliant job. I don't think he's invested enough.
Yeah. Well, I would agree with that, but he's been restrained in doing so. Citizens United, it looks like we're in store for the most negative political campaign season in history. A new study by the Wesleyan Media Project, very nonpartisan organization, shows that this election season so far has been the most negative in history. 70% of political ads so far have been negative. Outside interest groups have increased their advertising activity by 1,100% since 2008. 86% of those ads are negative. The candidates themselves, they've gone from 8% negative in the last campaign to so far 52% this time around. So, you know, is this good for our democracy, driving campaigns with negative ads? Dan?
One thing real quick, I think we have to be very clear that President Obama was not constrained at all back in 2009 when the Democrats controlled all of Washington, so we have to put that to rest. On the campaign thing, I think
what does that mean?
Back to the first point, we were talking about President Obama being constrained and not being able to implement his goals. That wasn't the case in 2009.
Oh, absolutely it was.
No, it absolutely was not. Democrats controlled Congress.
He had to put a third of that stimulus had to be tax cuts just to satisfy the conservative Dems and the Republicans.
No Republicans vote for it, and I would argue that there's no such thing as a conservative Democrat.
Lieberman isn't even a Democrat.
I would say most Democrats that we have right now are very much conservative, and they pushed farther to the right. I would argue that Obama himself is not, you know, he's kind of a center-right person. I would argue that he's not really the Democrat that you probably see him as.
I don't think you can call somebody a conservative when they view the fundamental role of government as having a larger and larger impact in everybody's daily lives.
Conservatives seem to view the government as having a larger and larger impact when it comes to war making, or when it comes to imposing on people's First Amendment rights in terms of political protest, or when it comes to a number of things. I mean, look at Bush, for example. I mean, he increased the size of government tremendously.
He did. It's spending from 2000.
Or Rick Scott, you know, what people are smoking, right? What people are doing in their bedrooms, all over the, you know, it's.
Well, back to the spending. I mean, the stimulus was supposed to cost $787 billion, and now it's estimated to have cost over $830 billion. I think that's a pretty large package.
No, it's not.
And
I think that's $2.7 trillion.
I think that's much
George
too
Bush
large.
blew a $2.5 trillion hole
It's not hard
inside
to just
of our
keep
economy.
spending money, but actually finding real solutions to the real problems takes a lot more effort.
Federal revenues in 2007 were at an all-time high. From the time President Bush took office.
In inflation, in inflated dollars, not in real dollars. Right now, we have revenues and spending that are at 60-year lows.
Well, what I'm talking about is in 2007, federal revenues were at an all-time high. They'd increased by 20+ percentage points under President Bush. Spending at that same time increased by 60 percentage points. So if you want to talk about spending as an economic stimulus, we saw it under President Bush, who everybody says widely failed when it came to the economy.
But when it comes to government spending, you do get more revenue and you do get more job creation. It's just a matter of where those jobs occurred.
Well, I mean, there's a huge point here that Rania just made perfectly, which is if you build things and drop them on other countries and have them blow up, they're not going to produce wealth for you for years and years and years. Where if you do like Eisenhower did and you build highways that last 75 years and facilitate commerce, that's an investment.
But something that nobody talks about enough is you give stimulus money to hire teachers, for example, hire firefighters, public safety workers. But what happens when that money runs away, if it goes away, if Congress isn't going to appropriate that same amount of money every single fiscal year?
That's the problem if you're stuck with a bunch of conservative Republicans who are trying to bring down the economy for political purposes.
Yeah, but you can't spend $787 billion every single year on stimulus.
Well,
I mean, that's impossible.
Back, though. You'll be getting revenue back out of that. You'll have more consumers. You'll have more people to tax. You're getting money out of that.
But once that money goes away, those jobs are gone unless they're continuously funded with taxpayer money every single year.
You have taxpayer money coming back from.
Apropos of all of this is that the Tea Party seems to be the major force that's driving the idea that let's all bow down to Grover Norquist, that there shall be no taxes. Dick Lugar is in big trouble in the Republican long time, since 1976 this guy's been in the Senate, from Indiana, and he's 10 points down below a Tea Party guy. So, does this mean that the Republican Party, as we've known it since Reconstruction, is dead?
I think what we're seeing is at the grassroots level is a lot of people voters saying, look, we want people who are going to say no. We're tired of all the debt. We're tired of huge amounts of deficits.
And we know Reagan, Bush, and Bush who ran up most of that debt. So you want people to say, no, we're tired of the Republicans?
I don't think people are looking at that. I think people are saying, what situation...
Republicans aren't talking about that, but that's the truth.
Here's the thing, though, is that I think everybody forgets, everybody assumes that the Tea Party was a reaction to President Obama. It wasn't. It was a reaction to President Bush and Republicans who blew an opportunity last decade to really fundamentally reshape government and make it smaller. They didn't. They expanded government under President Bush.
I would highly disagree with that. President Obama really riled up the right. I mean, the right was terrified of him. The Tea Party came directly out of that fear.
The history is very, very clear, is that the movement started before President Obama. It started during the bailouts.
You're thinking of the Ron Paul. You're thinking of the Ron Paul movement of Tea Partiers. That's not the same as what we're talking about right now.
And the Libertarians.
I covered some protests right after the bank bailout under President George W. Bush, where people were angry about it. Whether you're an R or a D, people were angry that was happening.
The banksters had robbed us and we're giving them cash, and they're still, lighting their cigars.
A lot of them did
bills.
pay the money back. A lot of the banks.
And people aren't getting upset at Dick Lugar because he's President Obama. People are upset at Dick Lugar because of the way he's voted in the past, and he voted for all this increased spending.
He supported to bail out the auto industry. He supported the START nuclear treaty, and he supported the 2 Obama Supreme Court nominees who were moderates.
Well, to go back to your original question about is there room for moderate Republicans, in what we're seeing right now with Republicans in states and nationwide, you're just seeing this sort of regression. Backwards when it comes to women's rights, when it comes to marriage equality, when it comes to the economy. It's all austerity. It's all, shrinking government, like drowning it in a bathtub. I mean, and this is what, this is the base of the Republican Party. This is what the base, I guess, wants now, is this sort of Tea Party-like figure. And I think you can see that really demonstrated with Mitt Romney and the way he flip-flopped on so many issues to appear more, right-wing, to appear more conservative, or
turn himself into a pretzel. Is Mitt Romney going to be able to can he pull the Tea Party along?
I think what we're going to see in the general election is a lot of Tea Party groups are going to back Mitt Romney. I mean, they see that that President Obama has increased the debt $5 trillion in his 3 years. I mean, that's more than President Bush in a shorter amount of time.
Talk about the debt, though, as though it's something that Americans care about. Even people on the right care about jobs right now, because that's what's affecting their daily lives. Not this debt that's like years and years down the road that isn't an immediate problem.
And the other thing that both Republicans and Democrats agree on is that they don't trust Washington, they don't trust Congress, they don't trust politicians. So when you have that dynamic...
Because these politicians are just kowtowing to the big corporations.
They're in the pockets of these big banks. I mean, even Democrats and Republicans both are in the pockets of these huge...
We have just 30 seconds before the break. I have a really quick question. This is the Republican logo behind us, more or less. What's the deal with flipping the stars upside down? Betsy Ross had the star right side up. In 2000, when George Bush was running for president, they flipped him upside down. So now it's the satanic star instead of the American flag star. I don't understand why. Does anybody know?
I didn't know that was a thing.
It's a great question.
It's a question for 12 years. I've been sitting going, hey, more Rumble coming up after the break.
The decline of American power continues.
Are things in our country so bad that it might actually be time for a revolution?
And it turns out that a popular drink at Starbucks has a surprising ingredient: bugs.
You know how sometimes you see a story and it seems so whole and complete, you think you understand it, and then you glimpse something else. You hear or see some other part of it and realize everything you thought you knew, you don't know? I'm Thom Hartmann. Welcome to The Big Picture.
Welcome to the Ilona Show, where you'll get the real headlines with none of the mercy. The problem with the mainstream media today is that they're completely disconnected from the viewers and from what actually matters to those viewers. And so that's why young people just don't watch TV anymore. If they want news, they go online and read it. But we're trying to take those stories that people actually care about and transfer them back to TV.
Capital Account. I'm Lauren Lister.
Welcome back to tonight's Big Picture Rumble. Joining me tonight are Dan Holler, Communications Director at Heritage Action for America, Rania Khalek, journalist and regular contributor to AlterNet, and Nicholas Balassi, senior video reporter at the Daily Caller. And thank you all for joining me, and I got it right. Florida Governor Rick Scott apparently thinks it's a good idea to arm up Republicans for the RNC convention coming up in Tampa later this year. The city said, you know, we're going to have some conflicting forces here. Let's make sure there's nothing that could be a weapon. And so they made crowbars illegal, string more than 6 inches. I guess they're worried about garroting people. I don't get it. Water guns, squirt guns. Maybe they think people will put LSD in them or something. I don't know what. But they just, you know, none of this stuff. So, and then the mayor, at the request of the police department apparently, goes to Rick Scott and says, can we also ban guns for 4 days? And Rick Scott says no, which is not his job. The governor's job is not to interpret the Constitution. That's, you know, court's job. Are our rights, the 4 out of 5 Americans who don't own guns, the 99 out of 100, or probably more like 995 out of 1,000 Americans who don't walk around with guns, it's probably even a bigger number than that, aren't our rights to the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness being stomped on by these gun nuts?
Well, there are no guns allowed in the actual arena, the actual center, and there are no guns going to be allowed in the Secret Service protected area.
Right,
outside of that.
Of course, but there's this whole city that's going to be filled with politicians from all over the planet. The hotels, the nightclubs, the restaurants, the strip bars, all the places where the lobbyists and the Republicans love to hang out. And there's people going to be packing heat? Really? And the Occupy protesters, I mean, did Rick Scott, I don't think he said it, but, you know, it's been in the mouth of more than one conservative commentator that Scott's doing a great job because these Republicans need to protect themselves from the Occupy people with their strength.
I mean, basically, what the mayor asked was, hey, can you suspend the U.S. Constitution and the Florida Constitution for 4 days? Absolutely, that's
in
exactly
New York City, they have a ban on guns.
It's funny because in both Tampa and Charlotte, where the DNC is going to be in September, Charlotte, North Carolina, these concealed carry laws will not be put on hold, but the First Amendment will. And I think it really shows that when it comes to not just the right, but, you know, the guns rights advocates in general, the Second Amendment trumps everything else, even the First Amendment, right? So in Florida, you've got, I mean, a lot of these ordinances in Florida and Charlotte, and a lot of these sort of temporary, no string, no gas masks, no bottles of water that are empty that could be misconstrued as trash. You know, these things are all banned because they could be used as weapons. This is going to affect protesters. Protesters could actually get arrested.
It will. Okay. Did you say quickfire? Irene, okay, thank you. Last question, quickfire. CEOs in America now, on average, make 206 times more than their workers, and in the Fortune 100, it's like way above that. So the question, pretty simple: are CEOs paid too much? You know, average CEO, Fortune 500, $10.2 million bucks.
Yes.
Okay.
I hope to be a CEO someday, so I'm going to say no. That's the American dream.
Okay.
The American dream.
I would say that's up to the shareholders.
Yeah, I would say as long as the average income for a family doctor is $160,000 a year, a rocket scientist is $98,000 a year, and a brain surgeon is $700,000 a year, anybody who's making $10 million a year to move money around is wildly overpaid. But that's just my opinion. Anyhow, thank you all for being here tonight. Much appreciated. Back in 1930, the all-white school board of Lemon Grove, California, decided they didn't want children of Mexican descent sitting next to their white children in class. So the school board built a separate school and then turned away the Mexican-American students from their original school and directed them to their new school, which was basically a big barn house. Within the local community, it became known as La Caballeriza, I believe, or the stable. But rather
it was essentially referred to as a barn. They were going to redo it. It was going to be a single room, and 2 teachers were going to educate 70 children. So they were quite shocked and very unhappy because
But rather than just accepting the new segregated school, the parents protested. They sought help from the Mexican consul in San Diego, eventually got legal representation, and won a court case against the Lemon Grove School Board, putting an end to the barnyard education plans. This happened more than 80 years ago, and today, history is repeating itself. Thanks to the radical anti-immigration law recently passed in Alabama, Hispanic children are afraid to go to school. That's because the law requires Alabama school officials to check the immigration status of kids in the public schools. 99% of the children in Alabama's K-12 public education system are American citizens. But those who don't look like citizens, at least by the opinion of these people in the state, mainly because their skin isn't white, are subject to prying questions and unnecessary paperwork to prove their citizenship. And while most were born here and are citizens, in some cases their parents are not. And they're terrified their parents will be identified and deported, and they'll end up orphans and wards of the state. A wrenching tearing apart of families that's already happened to more than 5,000 children in America just in the past year, and will likely happen to another 10,000 over the next 5 years. This creates a hostile educational environment, to say the very least, that's leading to record numbers of Hispanic students going absent from school. Since the law went into effect, Hispanic student absentee rates have tripled, while other students' absentee rates have remained flat. Also, since the law was passed, the dropout rate among Hispanic students has exploded. These troubling numbers caught the eye of the U.S. Justice Department, which wrote a letter to the state of Alabama on Thursday warning of the effects of this law on Hispanic students. The letter read, "The law has diminished access to and quality of education for many of Alabama's Hispanic children, resulting in missed school days, chilled or prevented the participation of parents in their children's education, and transformed the climates of some schools into less safe and welcoming spaces for Hispanic children." The Justice Department went on to say that this law could have lasting effects on Hispanics in Alabama, since if they're denied the education they need as a child, they'll have a difficult time finding a good job as an adult. Of course, that might have been the point altogether. You see, there's always been a fear in white America that their grip on economic and political power is slipping. That's why minorities, up until a half-century ago, were always segregated in schools and denied good-paying jobs in our economy. When a generation of minorities, whether they were black, Irish, Italian, or Hispanic, are denied an adequate education and equal access to our economy, it takes generations for that minority to recover. And while Irish and Italian Americans have recovered from generations of discrimination, probably largely because they're white, and overcome destructive stereotypes that suggested something was wrong with their genes, black Americans still have a long way to go to overcome hundreds of years of slavery, discrimination, and racism, as do Hispanics. President Lyndon Johnson made huge strides in giving minorities a chance to live the American dream. By desegregating schools and passing the Great Society legislation, minorities across America were lifted up, educated, and given a chance to pursue their dreams. And in the decades that followed, more and more minorities found themselves in the middle class, with their numbers growing along with their political power. That didn't sit too well with many in white America who found their privileged position in our nation threatened. So the campaign to reverse the strides made by LBJ to help minorities began, really got rolling. The Reagan tax cuts, the embrace of trickle-down economics in the 1980s, kept the mostly white Americans at the top of the economic ladder, firmly entrenched in their positions. The undoing of welfare and much of the Great Society in the 1980s and 1990s by Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton ripped the social safety net out from under minorities who were just starting to get a footing in America after centuries of discrimination. And now there are the anti-immigration laws that make young Hispanic Americans afraid to go to school and work. And there are the voter ID laws that kick mostly minority voters off the rolls, silencing them in our democracy. These are the last gasps of a small group of racist, terrified, and frankly stupid white people in America. And those driving this assault don't even try to hide their fear. You can see it in books like Suicide of a Superpower, written by Pat Buchanan, which contains chapters titled The End of White America and The Death of Christian America. Or in flippant remarks by political figures like Joni Brunstetter, the wife of North Carolina State Representative Peter Brunstetter, who authored a bill banning same-sex marriage because, according to his wife, quote, the Caucasian race is diminishing, and therefore whites need to be, quote, reproducing with each other. America is changing rapidly, and the white racists among us can't stand it. For the first time, minorities and not whites made up the majority of baby births last year in the United States. So by 2050 or sooner, whites will no longer be the majority in America. And luckily for Pat Buchanan, he'll likely be long gone by then. In fact, 12 states plus the District of Columbia already have white populations below 50% among children under 5 years old. Whether those in power like it or not, a segregated America where whites hold all the power is not the future of America. And here's something that'll make the white power elites even crazier. Muslim populations around the world are now growing at twice the rate of non-Muslim populations. So not only might white America be in danger in the future, but Christian America too in danger. And whites can either accept this truth, embrace it, and begin building an economy and government that is inclusive of all people, regardless of race and religion, or the racist whites can continue to stupidly flail against it. America didn't work when we had apartheid. In fact, it led to a brutal civil war. And the efforts of the white racists in Alabama and Arizona and Texas to reimpose apartheid won't work either. We the people means all of us. We're all just people here. That's it for the big picture tonight. For more information on the stories we covered, visit our websites at tomhartmann.com, freespeech.org, and RT.com. Also, check out our 2 YouTube channels. There are links at tomhartmann.com. This entire show is also available as a free video podcast on iTunes. And you can visit tomhartmann.com to download the audio podcast of our daily noon to 3 radio show. And we have a free Thom Hartmann iPhone and iPad app at the App Store. You can send us feedback at Twitter at Tom_Hartmann, on Facebook at Tom_Hartmann, on our blogs, message boards, and telephone comment line at tomhartmann.com. And don't forget, democracy begins with you. Get out there and get active. Tag You're It. We'll see you next week.